Hi guys and welcome to Calm Night Radio channel. Tonight we step into a winter so raw that even your breath feels borrowed, and the land around you seems determined to test every promise your body can make. You stand on the open edge of the American West in 1860 where the sky is wide, the grass is stiff with frost, and the cold arrives without asking whether you're ready. What happens when the wind is stronger than your walls, when morning water turns solid, and when comfort is not a right but a rumour? So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and while you are here, comment your location and your local time, because there is something wonderfully strange about people in different corners of the world gathering for the same quiet journey. The settlement ahead looks small, patient, and slightly miserable, which is honestly a fair description of winter itself. Now, dim the lights, and you walk toward the first hard season with your boots pressing brittle grass into the pale earth. The cold reaches you before the town does. It slips through your coat seams and settles at the back of your neck with a kind of rude confidence. You hear the wind moving across the plain in one long whisper, brushing dry stalks together like stiff bristles. The smell is clean, but not gentle. It carries frost, old dirt, distant animal musk, and the faint smoke of green wood burning badly somewhere ahead. By 1860, many western settlements were still little more than hopeful clusters of cabins, sheds, corrals, and muddy tracks. That is the plain truth of it. The Wild West was not yet a single thing. Not the polished stage set later stories would invent. It was a patchwork of mining camps, wagon stops, military posts, ranch claims, and river towns, each one improvising against distance and weather. You arrive at one of these places as winter tightens its grip, and every person you pass wears the same guarded expression, the look of someone measuring daylight like coins. The first frost has already changed the rhythm of life. Nothing is casual now. A man splitting kindling does not pause for conversation because his hands are racing the sunset. A woman lifting laundry from a line moves fast, because cloth left too long turns stiff as board. A child sent to fetch water carries the bucket with both hands, jaw set, as if performing a noble act for the kingdom of extremely bad timing. Your boots crunch over frozen ground. That sound becomes the little drumbeat of the season. Crunch, pause, breath. Crunch, pause, breath. Each step reminds you that the earth itself has gone hard. Ruts from wagon wheels are fixed in place like scars. Puddles wear a skin of ice thin enough to crack under your heel, sharp as glass and just as cheerful. You notice the buildings first by their shapes. Low cabins crouch against the wind. Their roofs are rough, their chimneys uneven, their windows small. Some are made of logs, some of sod, some of whatever boards could be hauled in and nailed together by hands that had other worries. A true luxury home this is not. The frontier version of interior design is mostly a contest between need and available lumber. Still, there is life here. You hear a hammer tapping somewhere behind a shed. Chickens mutter in a pen. A mule stamps and blows steam from its nostrils. Smoke drifts from a chimney and hangs in the air with the smell of grease and ash. That smoke means shelter, but it also means labour, because every thread of warmth in this place has been cut, carried, stacked, lit, and defended. The sky above is a pale metal colour, not quite grey, not quite blue. It looks cold enough to ring if you struck it. You pull your coat closer, feeling the rough cloth scrape your wrists. Under your boots, the ground is hard and uneven. Under your breath, a little cloud blooms and disappears. That tiny vanishing act starts to bother you. It feels like the day is eating pieces of you. You learn quickly that winter on the plains is not only about snow. Sometimes the worst cold comes in dry, clear weather, when the wind strips warmth from your skin and the sun provides moral support at best. Historians broadly agree that settlers in the mid-19th century dealt not just with low temperatures, but with constant exposure, especially in open country where trees were scarce and windbreaks had to be made rather than found. You feel that exposure in your face at once. Your cheeks sting, your lips tighten. The tip of your nose becomes a separate political entity with its own complaints. A wagon rattles past, the wheels groaning. the driver hunched deep in a scarf. He does not wave much. Winter reduces everyone to essentials. Greeting a stranger is nice. Keeping fingers functional is nicer. You move deeper into the settlement and begin to notice the small preparations that reveal how people think here. Firewood is stacked beside walls in tidy rows. Animal hides hang stiff from a line. Doors are padded with scraps of cloth at the bottom to block drafts. Crates, barrels, and broken tools are not thrown away lightly, because anything might become patching material. Kindling or insulation once the cold worsens. Waste is a luxury for warmer regions. One curious frontier detail appears near the edge of a yard, and it is not glamorous. You see patties of dried buffalo dung stacked to cure. Yes, truly, buffalo chips, as they were commonly called, served as fuel in areas where timber was limited. Romantic, is it not? The west gives you broad horizons, dramatic sunsets, and a stove fed by baked bison leftovers. Still, on the plains, practicality wins every argument. Dry dung burns surprisingly well, and in hard weather no one wastes time pretending otherwise. A dog trots past, nose low, fur lifting in the wind. Even the animals seem busy. Horses wear frost along the edges of their manes. Cows huddle near fencing, their breath rising in thick bursts. The smell around them is warm and sour and alive. One of the few scents in the air that suggests actual heat. You understand, standing there, why people and animals often stayed close in severe weather. Shared warmth was not poetic, it was arithmetic. Toward evening, the town changes tone, the light becomes amber, then thin. Shadows stretch over the frozen street. Windows that looked blank now glow softly, one by one, with lamplight or firelight. You hear doors closing, latches falling, someone calling children inside. It is a small chorus of retreat. The night does not arrive all at once out here. It seeps across the land, and everyone behaves as though they know better than to challenge it. Your own body starts doing its quiet calculations. Fingers first, toes second, then ears, then cheeks, then the strange cold spot between your shoulders where the wind keeps finding a gap. You rub your hands together and feel the sting of returning warmth, that prickling sensation both welcome and annoying. Your skin feels dry already. The air has taken all softness from it. You are beginning to understand a central frontier fact. Surviving winter is not a single heroic act. It is a chain of small choices made correctly, over and over, while tired. Shut the door quickly, bring the bucket in, hang the coat near the fire but not too near. Keep the matches dry, knock ice from the step, shake snow from the blanket, check the animal trough. Nothing looks dramatic. Everything matters. This kind of life demanded an exhausting awareness of materials. Wool mattered, leather mattered, grease mattered, a scrap of cloth mattered. The way a door fit in its frame mattered. A loose shutter could turn a room miserable. A cracked boot sole could turn a walk dangerous. You begin to see the settlement through that lens. Every object here is either helping a human body keep warmth, or threatening to let it escape. And yet, for all this caution, uncertainty hangs over the season. Scholars still debate how much later frontier mythology exaggerated sheer individual toughness, while downplaying the role of cooperation, trade networks, and indigenous knowledge in winter survival. Standing here, you can sense why the argument matters. No one truly conquers this landscape alone. Pride sounds lovely in summer. In winter it can get very quiet. The cold deepens as the sun falls. Smoke thickens above the cabins and the whole settlement takes on the smell of burning wood, tallow, damp wool, and stew. That smell is almost enough to make you emotional. Civilization, at its most honest, may simply be a pot simmering somewhere nearby. You pass a shed wall and lay your hand against it. The boards are rough, splintery, and cold enough to bite. The texture stays in your palm after you pull away. Nearby, a lantern swings from a hook, throwing a trembling pool of yellow light on packed earth. Insects are gone now, leaves are gone. The noise of summer is gone. Winter simplifies the world with ruthless efficiency. Inside one cabin, through a small window, you glimpse a family gathered close around a table. Their movements are slow with fatigue. One person sews, another bends over a bowl, a child leans toward the stove as if trying to worship at it. That little scene reveals more than any grand speech could. Warmth is not evenly distributed here. It pools in one room, around one source, within one narrow radius. Outside that circle, the dark waits patiently. Your stomach tightens from the cold and from hunger, because cold weather sharpens appetite even when food is plain. You imagine salt pork, coarse bread, beans, maybe coffee if fortune has been unusually kind. Settlers commonly depended on preserved staples through winter, especially flour, beans, bacon, cornmeal, and whatever could be dried or stored. Fresh produce was limited, and variety was often the first thing to vanish when temperatures dropped. The body does not care much about culinary adventure, though it wants fuel. The stars begin appearing overhead with startling clarity. Cold nights do that. The sky opens wide and brilliant, as if trying to distract you from the fact that your feet are freezing. You pause in the middle of the settlement road and listen. The wind has eased for a moment. In its place you hear faint voices indoors, the clink of metal, a horse shifting in straw, the soft thud of an axe from somewhere farther off. Human sounds, working sounds, refusing to disappear sounds. That is the real feeling of the first Western winter evening in 1860. Not glory, not drama, resolve. A settlement like this does not shine against the cold. It hunkers down and bargains with it, hour by hour. You breathe in smoke and frost together, feel the rough weight of your clothes on your shoulders, and recognize that comfort here will always be partial. Still, there is a stubborn dignity in that. People have come to this hard place and made routines against the ice, however fragile, however smoky, however patched. The night settles fully. Lamps glow behind thick glass. A door opens, spilling a stripe of firelight across the frozen ground, then closes again. The stripe vanishes at once. You stand for one more breath beneath the iron sky, hearing the land go still around the little settlement, and you know that the season has only just begun. You wake before sunrise because the cold has opinions about your sleep. It presses through the blanket, slips into your sleeves, and settles in the hollow behind your knees where comfort ought to live. The room is dark except for a weak grey seam of dawn at the window. The air smells of hash, old smoke, damp wool, and the faint sour trace of boots left too near the wall. You lie still for a moment, listening to the house around you. Timber gives a dry little pop. Something taps against the outside boards in the wind. From the far corner comes the tiny scratch of a mouse conducting business with unearned confidence. This is your shelter for winter in the West in 1860, and shelter is a generous word. Cabin sounds noble. Home sounds warm. The truth sits somewhere closer to box with ambitions. The walls are logs notched together by hand, with chinks filled by clay, mud, straw, or whatever mixture could be pressed into gaps before the weather turned ugly. Those gaps never stay filled as neatly as people hope. Wood shrinks, clay cracks, wind learns the map. It always does. When you sit up, the mattress gives a tired sigh. It is stuffed with corn husks, straw, or perhaps feathers if someone has known a brief season of luck. Under your palm, the ticking cloth feels coarse and cool. The blanket scratches your chin. Nothing in the room invites softness. Not really. Comfort on the frontier often means only that the conditions have stopped actively insulting you for a few minutes. You swing your feet to the floor and regret it immediately. The boards are cold enough to make your toes curl. In some homes, the floor is packed dirt, which is not exactly an improvement unless your dream has always been to start the day by touching frozen earth indoors. A few cabins have rugs or hides laid down near the bed, but such things are precious. Most surfaces inside a winter dwelling are either rough, hard, or determined to remind you that nature still has visiting rights. By the window, a skin of ice has formed on the inside corner of the glass. If the cabin has no true glass, then the opening may be covered with oiled cloth, paper, or a shutter that keeps out some weather and all sense of cheer. Small windows are common because larger ones leak heat and cost money. Light, then, is rationed almost as carefully as fuel. Morning arrives. but it does not exactly flood the room. It seeps in like a shy acquaintance. You dress quickly because hesitation is expensive. Your shirt has gone cold overnight. Pulling it on feels like putting on a damp opinion. The seams rub your shoulders. Your breath clouds in front of you. Even indoors, you can see it. That little fact tells you a great deal about the cabin without saying a word. A house that cannot keep your breath from turning visible is not winning the argument with winter. The hearth sits at one end of the room, blackened by soot, with yesterday's ashes huddled in the firebox like a failed plan. If there is a stove instead, it is iron and practical and never quite as magical as you hoped. A stove promises heat. Yes, but only if you feed it constantly and only near its reach. Warmth does not spread politely through a frontier cabin. It gathers near the source like people at a gossip table. Step back 3 paces, and the air remembers it is January. You kneel to coax life into the morning fire, kindling first, then chips of wood, then a careful breath and another, the smoke coming at your face as though offended by your efforts. Your fingers grow dusty with ash. The smell thickens, bitter and familiar. When the first flame catches, it makes a low, eager sound, and the room changes mood at once. Not temperature, not yet. Mood. That is how winter toys with you. Firelight offers hope several minutes before it offers actual comfort. As the flame builds, you can study the room more clearly. The roof overhead is made of poles, boards, sod, shingles, or some frontier variation of prayer and local materials. In storms it may drip. In hard wind it may hum. Snow can pile on top and insulate, or weigh dangerously on weaker structures. Some settlers on the Great Plains lived in sod houses cut from thick prairie turf, especially where timber was scarce. Those homes could be surprisingly good at holding steady temperatures, though they came with their own charm, such as falling dirt, insects, and the occasional suspicion that your wall might also be part meadow. In a log cabin, the walls hold the memory of the trees they came from. You can feel it in the grain beneath your hand, in the resinous scent that sometimes rises when the room warms. But logs alone do not make a snug refuge. Chinking matters. Roofing matters. The fit of the door matters very much. A badly hung door can admit a narrow ribbon of cold that slithers across the floor all day. You notice it when your ankle suddenly goes numb in one spot and nowhere else. That tiny snake of air becomes an enemy with a schedule. On the table rests a tin cup, a crockery bowl, a heel of bread wrapped in cloth, maybe a knife with a worn handle. The table itself is scarred by years of cutting, scraping, and mending. Every piece of furniture has work in its bones. A chair is not decorative, a chest is not elegant, a peg on the wall is a system. Shelves hold dried beans, lard, meal, coffee if fortune smiles, and maybe a jar of preserves so precious it might as well wear jewellery. The room is sparse, not because people lacked imagination, but because every object had to justify its presence against weight, cost, and use. Smoke lifts up the chimney, but not all of it leaves. A cabin interior often keeps a haze of it, especially in bad weather or poor draught. Your eyes sting slightly. Soot collects above the hearth and along the rafters. Fabrics absorb the odour until coats, blankets, and hair carry the same campfire note for months. In another life, this might feel rustic. Here it is simply the smell of not freezing. People on the frontier often used anything available to improve insulation. Cracks could be stuffed with rags, moss, clay, newspaper, or mud. Hides might hang over doors. Quilts could be pinned against walls. A rolled cloth at the threshold blocked a draught far better than pride ever did. You begin to see that house building on the frontier never really ended. Once a structure went up, it entered a lifelong conversation with weather, and winter always got the loudest turn. There is a strange intimacy to living in one room through cold months, cooking, eating, mending, resting, washing, and sleeping all happen within arm's reach of the same hearth. Privacy becomes a concept more than a reality. Sounds are shared by all, so are smells. Stew, smoke, wet leather, lamp oil, singed cloth, animal fat, and unwashed wool mingle into a domestic perfume that no modern candle company would dare market. Yet in that closeness, there is also a kind of harsh efficiency. Every motion is measured, every tool has its hook, every step avoids wasting heat. You feel the cold most sharply at the edges of things, near the window, along the floor, by the door latch, at the wall behind the bed. These are the weak points, the places where winter reaches inside with 2 fingers and reminds you who built the land first. Some mornings frost traces delicate patterns along the interior boards, tiny silver feathers blooming in corners, while you stand there holding a cup and pretending not to be deeply insulted by decorative ice inside your own house. Historians generally agree that housing quality varied widely across the American West, depending on region, wealth, available materials, and whether the dwelling was meant as a temporary stop or a lasting claim. That variety matters. One family might pass the season in a sturdy cabin with a decent stove and solid stores. Another might survive in a dugout cut into a riverbank, a canvas shelter reinforced with poles, or a half-finished shack still arguing with the first snowfall. Winter did not grade on effort. It graded on preparation, luck, and location, with luck often leading the discussion. There is also the matter of vermin, because hardship dislikes being lonely. Mice find grain, rats find corners, fleas and lice care very little about your frontier dignity, a warm body, a blanket, a mattress stuffed with organic material. All these attract life that is not paying rent. You hear the quiet rustle at night and know that survival here is a crowded enterprise. Even the walls feel inhabited. It keeps a person humble. Nothing says civilization like sharing a cabin with creatures who disapprove of your storage methods. The light strengthens outside, though inside the cabin it remains muted, amber near the fire and grey elsewhere. Your hands finally begin to loosen as the flames do their work. Sensation returns in stages. First ache, then sting, then something like forgiveness. You hold your palms toward the heat and smell a faint singe where the skin has gotten too close. The front of you warms while your back stays cold. This becomes a frontier specialty, being cooked and chilled at the same time like a human pie with poor planning. The roof creaks, wind noses around the eaves. Somewhere outside, a bucket knocks lightly against a post. That sound travels into the room with unreasonable clarity because winter air carries noise so well. There are moments when the cabin feels less like a sealed shelter than like a listening device placed inside the weather. You hear the yard, the animals, the wagon road, the chop of an axe, the cough from a neighbour's place, and under it all the steady low breathing of the fire. The world never disappears, it presses right up against the walls. Despite all this, people grew attached to these dwellings. They whitewashed walls when they could. They laid a cloth on the table. They carved shelves, stitched quilts, braided rugs from scraps, polished a tin lamp, kept a Bible or a letter packet in the driest corner. Those small acts were not frivolous. They were declarations. A cabin might be rough, leaky, cramped, and one draft away from mutiny, but it was still a claim against emptiness. It held names, habits, griefs, recipes, fevers, hopes, and the sound of familiar voices at dusk. There is a scholarly debate about how typical the romantic log cabin image really was across the West, since many people lived in adobe structures, sod houses, dugouts, tents, boarding rooms, or mixed material homes shaped by local conditions. The popular image endures because it is simple and symbolic, but the real frontier was much more inventive. People built with what they had, where they stood, using mud, grass, hides, timber, earth, and stubbornness in combinations that would make an architect blink very slowly. As the fire settles into a steady burn, the room becomes almost bearable, not warm in any generous sense. Bearable. You take in the worn spoon, the patched quilt, the hat on the peg, the pail near the door, the faint line of daylight around the shutter, and you understand the cabin properly at last. It is not a fortress. It is a negotiation. Every day you seal, patch, stack, light, sweep, and brace. Every night the cold tests the terms again. You lift the cup, now warm enough to hold, and stand in the centre of the room. The boards beneath you are still cool. The wall at your shoulder still leaks a little air. Smoke still curls where it should not. Yet the fire answers with a steady glow. The tin cup warms your fingers, and the dim interior gathers itself around that one small centre of life. On the frontier, a winter house does not defeat the season. It merely gives you a place to continue arguing with it indoors. Morning begins with cloth that feels colder than the air deserves. You pull on a shirt that has spent the night near the wall, and the fabric touches your skin with the emotional warmth of a legal document. For a second your shoulders tighten, and your breath catches. Then you keep dressing, because in a winter like this, hesitation is an expensive hobby. What you wear in the West in 1860 is not about style in the modern sense. It is about holding on to the heat your body still makes. That heat is precious. It rises from your chest, your belly, your back, then tries to slip away through every loose cuff. Open collar and worn seam. Clothing becomes your first shelter, the small personal cabin you carry around all day. A poor one leaks. A good one buys time. You start with a base layer that is simple and serviceable. Linen shirts were common and sometimes cotton, though cotton in cold weather can feel cruel once damp. Wool is the true ally. Scratchy, stubborn, slightly accusatory wool, it rubs the neck, snags at dry skin, and rarely earns compliments. But it traps warmth even when conditions are less than ideal. And on the frontier, practical virtues outrank charm by a mile. A wool shirt or undergarment sits against you with solid seriousness. Like an old friend who never smiles but always shows up. Then come more layers. A vest helps keep the chest warm without restricting the arms too much. A heavier overshirt, a flannel piece, perhaps a coat lined with whatever could be managed. Men often wore wool trousers, sturdy shirts, suspenders, waistcoats, and outer coats of wool or buckskin depending on region and work. Women layered chemises, petticoats, stockings, dresses, shawls, aprons, cloaks, and woolen wrappers. The exact combination varied, but the principle stayed the same. More trapped air, more warmth, more chances to keep the wind from treating your ribs like public property. The sound of getting dressed in winter is its own quiet performance. Cloth rasping over cloth, leather creaking, buttons clicking through buttonholes, a belt buckle tapping wood, stockings sliding over chilled skin. You become very aware of touch. The coarseness of wool, the stiffness of a frozen boot, the smooth worn edge of a coat cuff, the small relief of a scarf winding around your throat where the air had been sharpest. Every layer changes the way the world meets your body. Stockings matter more than people in warm houses like to imagine. Cold feet can sour the soul by breakfast. Wool stockings, if you have them, are a blessing even when they sag an itch. Some people wrapped feet in cloth before putting on boots. Boots themselves might be leather, often sturdy but far from modern insulated marvels. A boot can keep out brush and mud, but once cold and damp it turns into a portable complaint attached to each ankle. You stamp your feet, flex your toes, and pretend determination is a heating method. Gloves or mittens are just as important, though they are not always available in abundance. Gloves allow you to grip tools, reins, buckets, and latches, but fingers lose warmth faster when separated. Mittens keep heat better, turning the hand into one shared warm room. That is less helpful if you need to mend a harness or strike a match. Frontier life loves these little trade-offs. Warmth versus dexterity, speed versus thrift, comfort versus what is actually possible at the moment. You pull on an outer coat at last, and its weight settles across your shoulders like a practical blessing. Coats were commonly made of wool, heavy broadcloth, or sometimes skin and fur. Buffalo robes, bison hides with the fur left on, were famous for their insulating power and widely valued in colder regions. A robe thrown over the shoulders or laid across the legs in a wagon could mean the difference between misery and dangerous exposure. The smell of such coverings lingered too, rich and animal, a mix of hide, dust, fat and weather. Nothing delicate about it, very reassuring all the same. The head is another battlefield. Hats are not merely decorative shadows for your face. Felt hats, wool caps, knitted pieces, earmuffs where available, scarves tied high, all become part of the campaign. Heat escapes quickly from exposed skin, especially in wind. Your ears feel this truth with theatrical outrage. A good scarf around the neck and lower face softens the air before it reaches your lungs. Without one, each breath can feel like a draft through the chest. With one, your own breath dampens the cloth and leaves it cold after a time. Winter offers no perfect solutions, only better mistakes. The smell of winter clothing becomes familiar quickly. Smoke from the hearth, leather oil, wet wool drying by the fire, faint sweat from labour, tallow from hands that have handled lamps or grease, maybe a trace of horse if you work close to animals. These scents settle into fabric until your coat seems to belong as much to the season as to you. On the frontier, garments are not fashionable statements. They are working companions. They remember your days. You notice how people judge weather partly by how many layers they can tolerate while still moving. Too few. And the wind cuts straight through. Too many. And labour becomes clumsy, heavy, damp with sweat. That dampness is dangerous. One of the cruel tricks of winter is that overheating while chopping wood, walking hard, or hauling water can be nearly as troublesome as underdressing. Sweat cools, wet cloth chills. A man who works in his coat until steaming may soon have to open it, then close it, then curse at it under his breath while pretending not to be engaged in a lifelong disagreement with buttons. There is a rhythm to winter dressing. You leave the cabin layered up, neck wrapped, hands covered, coat closed high, then you split wood and loosen the collar. You carry feed and push back the hat. You cross open ground and pull the scarf up again. You stop in the wind and button the coat tight. You step indoors and steam faintly in the warmer air near the fire, removing one layer before you turn into a damp dumpling. Then you put it back on before going out again. The whole day becomes a conversation between body heat and weather, conducted through cloth. Historians generally agree that ready-made clothing existed by 1860, especially in towns and through trade. But many frontier people still relied heavily on home sewing, mending, refitting, and passing garments down through households. That means winter clothing was often patched, altered, lined, relined, and repaired until original cloth became a kind of family legend hidden beneath newer stitches. Elbows got reinforced, cuffs were turned, blankets were cut into coats, dresses became children's garments. Worn trousers might surrender their good fabric to patch some other item still considered worth saving. Nothing useful retired easily. You can feel those patches under your fingers. A square of different wool at the knee, a cuff backed by old shirt linen, a seam worked by hand with thread that does not match but holds firmly. There is beauty in that, though no one out here has time to call it beauty. It is simply the look of making do. People often imagine frontier hardship in big dramatic strokes, but survival is frequently sown with tiny ones. Women's winter dress brought its own difficulties and strengths. Long skirts trapped warmth, but also collected snow, mud, burrs, and moisture at the hem. Petticoats added insulation, yet made movement heavier. Shawls could be wrapped close around shoulders and head, forming a cocoon against wind, especially when stepping outdoors for chores. Cloaks and knit goods were prized, so were sturdy stockings and stout shoes. Those shoes on the frontier had an exhausting habit of wearing out exactly when most needed. A hem stiff with frost and a pair of cold ankles can turn even a short walk into a lecture from the universe. Children in winter had to be bundled as much as household means allowed. They grew quickly, of course, which is very inconsiderate when cloth is scarce. Too small are coat pinches, too large lets in drafts, caps slide, mittens vanish, boots are outgrown at impressive speed. Yet children also adapted with startling resilience, running errands with red noses and fierce little expressions, wrapped in scarves until only eyes remained. Their cheeks burned pink in the cold. Their fingers, less admirably, found ways to touch ice whenever specifically told not to. A quirky detail from the era is how often newspaper, cloth scraps, and extra wool were stuffed into boots, bodices, sleeves, or hats for added insulation. It was not elegant, but elegance does very little for a numb toe. Some people wore multiple socks, even mismatched pairs, or tied bits of flannel around vulnerable joints. Improvisation was common because supply lines could be unreliable and money tighter than a frozen latch. The body had no patience for waiting on better merchandise. The wind changes how clothing feels. On a still day, your coat may seem enough. Let the breeze rise across open prairie, and suddenly every seam is under review. The air finds the gap where glove meets sleeve. It works into the collar. It lifts a skirt edge or pushes through trouser cloth at the thigh. Wind is less like temperature and more like a personality, one that insists on meeting you directly. You lower your head, narrow your eyes, and keep walking. The outer layers snap and rustle. The scarf tugs against your chin. Your ears retreat into the nearest available fabric and file a formal complaint. There is scholarly uncertainty about how evenly frontier communities had access to truly adequate winter garments, because records often highlight trade goods and ideal inventories more clearly than the daily reality of wear, shortage, and replacement. We know woolens and hides were essential, and we know many households worked tirelessly to produce, maintain, and adapt clothing. But the gap between what should have been worn and what could actually be worn was sometimes wide, especially for poorer settlers, migrants in transit, labourers, and isolated families. In a hard season, that gap could be felt in the bones. Touch becomes your teacher. The numbness at the fingertips tells you when gloves are failing. The sting on the knees tells you when the wind has found a weak spot. The ache at the shoulders tells you your coat is too light, or too damp, or both. Dry skin cracks at knuckles and lips. Wool brushes your neck raw if you do not arrange it carefully. A scarf grows stiff with frozen breath. Boots harden overnight by the door. Your whole wardrobe seems alive with moods and demands. And still, you are grateful for every layer. You see another person crossing the yard with a shawl pinned tight and a basket balanced on one hip. A man rides past with a buffalo robe over his lap and frost clinging to his moustache. A child stands by a doorway, coat buttoned wrong in haste, chin buried in a scarf. Everyone looks slightly overwrapped and slightly underprepared, which may be the frontier ideal. No one is fully protected. Everyone is trying. By midday, the sun shines with clear indifference. Light spills across the ground, bright on frost, but offers little heat. Your clothes hold what warmth they can. The inside of your coat feels close and human. The outside takes the weather. That distinction matters. You become aware that the body is a small furnace, and winter dressing is the craft of building walls around it without smothering the fire. When evening comes and you finally peel off the outer layers indoors, the sensation is nearly spiritual. Gloves laid near the hearth, boots tugged free with effort, scarf unwound, coat hung where smoke and warmth can dry it by degrees. Steam rises faintly from damp cuffs. The room smells of wool, leather, and relief. Your skin, where cloth pressed all day, feels tender and alive. On the peg hangs tomorrow's defence, already waiting. That is what dressing for a Wild West winter really means. Not swagger, not costume, strategy, layer by layer, knot by knot, patch by patch. You build a second skin against a season that would happily strip the first one bare. The garments itch, sag, bind, crease, and smoke. They also keep you moving. In 1860, that is more than enough reason to cherish them. The search for warmth begins outdoors, where the air bites first and explains itself never. You step into the morning carrying a hatchet, a rope, and the sort of determination people praise most when they do not have to come along. The sky is pale and hard. Frost rims the fence rails. Your boots strike the ground with a dull crunch, and each breath enters your chest cold enough to feel sorted and counted. In the American West of 1860, heat does not arrive through a pipe or switch. It must be found, gathered, hauled, chopped, dried, stacked, guarded, and spent with care. A fire is not a convenience. It is labour made visible. Every flame in a cabin has a history behind it, measured in miles walked, backs bent, hands split, and daylight used up. The problem is simple enough. Winter wants fuel. The land does not always provide it kindly. In wooded regions, trees offer the obvious answer, though even then the work is immense. Branches must be cut, trunks split, pieces carried home, and supplies protected from snow and damp. On the plains, however, timber may be scarce or absent altogether. Then the hunt becomes more inventive. Brush, roots, twisted shrubs, corn stalks, and dried animal dung all enter the conversation. Nobody out here has the luxury of being fussy about romance. A fire that burns is already beautiful. You head first toward a patch of scrub near a creek line, where cottonwood and willow may cling to the banks. Watercourses often held the nearest usable wood in open country, and everyone knew it. So did everyone else's axe. The best pieces disappear quickly. What remains may be green, crooked, rotten, or so twisted it seems to have taken up a personal mission against clean chopping. You bend, test branches with your gloved hand, and listen to the sound they make. Dry wood snaps sharply, damp wood yields with a tired softness and promises more smoke than heat. The smell of raw wood rises as you cut. It is sweet and wet and faintly alive. A small reminder that this fuel was once part of something rooted. Chips fly. The handle jars your palms, your shoulders warm under your coat from the repeated motion, but your face stays cold, and your nose keeps running in a way winter finds deeply amusing. You stop to wipe it with your sleeve, which is not elegant but is historically plausible enough to earn a nod from the age. When you drag a bundle of branches together, the rope bites into your fingers through the gloves. Weight gathers fast. Wood always looks manageable until you ask it to move. That is one of its oldest jokes. You heave the bundle, lean into the pull, and start back across frozen ground. The sled would be helpful if there were one. The horse would be lovely if it were spared. Often it is simply you, the rope, and the increasingly suspicious belief that heat should have to work a little harder to reach people. In areas with real stands of timber, wood cutting could occupy entire days. Men and boys often felled trees with axes or saws, then cut rounds and split them into stove lengths. The rhythm was repetitive and punishing. Strike, pause, turn, strike again. A clean split made a deep, satisfying crack. A knotty log answered with stubborn silence. Your hands tingled from the shock of each blow, and the grain sprayed pale against the darker bark. Sawdust clung to boots. Sap stuck to cuffs. Sweat gathered under layers, then cooled quickly whenever you stopped. Firewood asked for effort twice. Once while cutting, and again while carrying. Still thus, much of the West could not count on abundant forest. That is where one of the era's most famous frontier fuels enters with no concern for its reputation. Buffalo chips, dried bison dung. There it sits on the prairie, flattened by weather, baked by sun, and suddenly very interesting once snow comes on. It sounds comic to modern ears, and honestly it sounded comic to many people then too. But on the Great Plains, travellers, soldiers, settlers, and indigenous communities all used dried dung as fuel when wood was limited. Practical necessity has a way of silencing delicate opinions. You walk the grassland scanning the ground for grey-brown discs hardened enough to burn well. Fresh dung will not do. It must be dried thoroughly by time and weather. The older pieces feel light in the hand and break with a firm, crumbly snap. Their smell is far less dramatic than you fear. Sun and wind have done their quiet work. Still, there is no escaping the absurdity entirely. You gather your winter fuel one flat handful at a time, and somewhere in your mind a very refined ancestor faints onto a chaise lounge. Yet these chips burn with a steady heat, especially useful for cooking and slow fires. Their flame is not always grand, but they are plentiful, where herds have passed and trees have not. Children often collected them in baskets or sacks. Women did too. So did anyone with enough common sense to prefer a humble fire over a noble frieze. The scent they produce when burned is distinctive, earthy and dry, but familiar enough in prairie country to become part of the season's background. Necessity can train the senses to call many things normal. You also search for brush, dead roots, and any scrap wood from construction or broken tools that can be spared. Nothing combustible is ignored casually. A shattered crate may become kindling. Corn cobs might help start a fire. Even twisted sagebrush has value if gathered dry. Frontier households often maintained a mental map of everything around them that might burn eventually. It is a peculiar kind of wealth, measured not in coins but in future flames. There is sound everywhere in this labour. The chop of an axe, the whisper of grass against boots, the scrape of wood against wood when a pile shifts, a wagon wheel grinding over ruts, the cough of someone working nearby, ravens overhead, always sounding as if they know something unhelpful. Now and then the wind rises and blurs all smaller noises into one broad rush across the land. In those moments the task feels especially lonely. You're gathering little portions of warmth under a sky that appears to have no stake in the result. Back at the cabin, the next work begins. Fuel must be sorted. Thick pieces for longer burning, thin sticks for starting, damp materials set aside near enough to dry, but not so near as to catch, chips stacked under cover if possible, brush tied in bundles. Wood piles matter enormously because a careless stack sheds time and effort back into the weather. Snow can soak it, wind can scatter it, mud can rot the lower layers. A proper pile, even a modest one, looks almost ceremonial in winter. It is security made visible. The touch of fuel tells you its future. Dry wood feels lighter, sounds hollower when knocked together, and shows cracks at the ends. Green wood is heavier, colder, more secretive. It hisses in the fire and smoulders with a resentful little spit. Seasoned oak or hickory would be a treasure in some places, but settlers often used whatever species the local land allowed. Cottonwood, for instance, was common along waterways and useful, though not always beloved for its burning qualities. Beggars, frontier or otherwise, generally avoid rigorous consultations with wood critics. Fuel gathering reshapes the day. Instead of asking what you would like to do, winter asks what can burn and how soon can it be brought home. A household might consume astonishing amounts over a season. Cooking alone required steady fire. So did warmth, washing water, maybe a bit of light, maybe some iron heating for tools or mending. On especially cold nights, the fear was not just being uncomfortable. It was waking to a dead stove, a frozen bucket, and a room so cold your first breath felt like swallowing needles. Historians broadly agree that access to fuel was one of the most important variables in frontier winter survival, right alongside shelter, food, and clothing. Local geography shaped everything. Mountain settlements near timber had one set of burdens. Prairie homesteads had another. Mining camps might strip nearby slopes quickly. Army posts relied on supply systems, work parties, and whatever the surrounding terrain allowed. Indigenous communities often had deep knowledge of local fuel sources and seasonal patterns, though later frontier mythology rarely gave that knowledge the credit it deserved. The land taught hard lessons, but not always to the same students first. There is also the matter of theft, because scarcity invites close moral reasoning. A woodpile standing near a road could attract hungry eyes. Fence rails sometimes vanished into stoves during severe weather. Abandoned buildings were not always abandoned in the eyes of desperate people needing boards. Winter presses ethics through the same narrow gap as wind. Everyone claims necessity. Sometimes they are telling the truth. A more curious tidbit from the era is that buffalo chips were so common a travel fuel on the plains that emigrants wrote about them with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Some even complained when rain made the chips harder to collect or burn. Imagine explaining that sentence at a formal dinner in Boston. Out here it is simply logistics. The prairie offers what it offers. Your task is to stop being precious about the shape of it. By late afternoon, your arms ache with a deep, steady fatigue, the kind that settles into the shoulders and lower back and makes lifting a cup feel briefly philosophical. Your gloves smell of bark, earth, leather, and dust. Splinters have found places even through care. The cuffs of your trousers are brushed with frost and dry grass. You stack the final arm load under the eaves and stand back to inspect it. It is not a grand pile. It is enough for now. Those last three words carry a lot of weight on the frontier. Scholars still argue over how often popular memory exaggerates the self-sufficiency of isolated settlers. Because many communities survived winter through exchange as much as individual labour. One family might trade labour for wood. Another might buy cut fuel if they had means. Teamsters hauled loads to towns. Military escorts protected some routes. Neighbours borrowed, bartered, and sometimes quietly rescued each other from bad preparation. The image of one lone soul triumphing over weather makes a tidy story. Real winter survival was usually messier, more communal, and less interested in applause. As evening closes in, you bring in an armful for the night. The pieces knock together with a dense, satisfying sound. Indoors, the cabin smells of ash and stored food, and the faint sweetness of dried kindling. You kneel by the hearth and begin the ceremony again. Tinder, slivers, small sticks, then larger pieces once the flame has taken hold. Maybe a few chips added when needed. The first crackle is always a relief. The second is nearly music. Soon warmth begins to bloom from the fire, modest but real. The wood you dragged, the brush you snapped, the chips you gathered from frozen ground, all of it turns into heat against your shins. This is the plain miracle of frontier winter. Not that the land is conquered, not that the cold is beaten, only that after a day of searching, cutting, hauling, and stacking, you can sit close to the flames and feel your hands uncurl one finger at a time. Outside, the air grows sharper. Inside, the fire glows low and steady, fed by everything the day could wrestle from the season. That is what fuel means here. It is not just material. It is stored effort, saved daylight, future comfort, and one more night purchased from the cold with your own tired body. Water becomes difficult the moment winter decides to touch it. In warmer months, a bucket is a bucket, a creek is a creek, and a trip to the well is only another chore in a long day of chores. In a Wild West winter in 1860, water turns moody, stubborn, and strangely theatrical. It freezes in pails, skins over in troughs, stiffens washcloths, locks pump handles, and waits under ice as if deeply pleased with itself. You step outside before full daylight, carrying 2 empty buckets that knock lightly against your knees. The sound is hollow and metallic in the cold air. Frost lies over the yard in a pale crust. Your breath leaves your mouth in white clouds, and each inhale feels sharp enough to tidy your lungs. Somewhere nearby, a horse stamps in its stall. A board creaks. The world is awake, but only reluctantly. The nearest source of water may be a well, a creek, a spring, or a river, depending on where you live and what luck or geography has granted you. None of these options becomes easier in freezing weather. If the household has a well, the rope is rough against the hands and the pulley squeals with a thin complaining note. If there is a pump, it may stiffen or ice over. If the family depends on open water, then the path itself can be treacherous, the bank slick, and the surface frozen thick enough to require braking. You walk carefully because a spill is more than an annoyance. It is wasted effort, lost time, and possibly wet clothing, which is a frontier recipe for misery. Your boots press into hard ground. The leather feels stiff. The cold travels up from the soles into your ankles with quiet determination. By the time you reach the well, your fingers already know they are about to receive very poor news. The rope is the first insult. Even through gloves, it feels cold and dry and unkind. You lower the bucket into darkness, hearing the faint splash below, then haul it up hand over hand. The bucket seems twice as heavy on winter mornings. It rises dripping. Those droplets freeze almost at once along the rim and handle, turning practical metal into a little trap for skin. You grip carefully. Bare fingers on iron in this weather are a lesson you only need once. If there is no well and you must go to a creek, the labour becomes more dramatic. Ice forms along the edges first, then farther out, sometimes thin and glassy, sometimes thick and clouded. You test it with a pole or the heel of your boot. The surface gives a brittle crack, and the sound travels across the quiet like a shot. Then comes the hard part. You chop or hammer at the ice, breaking an opening wide enough to dip a bucket. Each blow sends a jolt through your arms. Shards skitter aside. Water appears beneath, black and moving, and somehow looks colder than the ice above it. The smell near open water in winter is sharp and mineral, mixed with mud, old reeds, and the faint sourness of the bank. It is not a lush smell. It is the bare scent of the earth being forced to reveal something it would rather hide. Your breath mingles with the vapour above the hole, your knuckles ache. The cuff of your glove grows damp where it touched the rim. That dampness matters immediately. Once the buckets are filled, the journey home begins at a pace somewhere between careful and desperate. Water sloshes. The handles bite into your palms. Your shoulders hunch against both weight and wind. The buckets seem to gain personality on the walk back, always leaning away at the wrong moment, always trying to teach you balance through mild cruelty. You set them down once, maybe twice, to rest your hands and flex feeling back into your fingers. The skin under the glove feels hot and numb at the same time. This daily work was ordinary for frontier households. Historians generally agree that hauling water was one of the most relentless tasks in 19th century domestic life, especially in winter, when even basic access could become difficult. A family needed water for drinking, cooking, washing dishes, making coffee, cleaning wounds, soaking beans, watering animals, and sometimes laundering when conditions permitted. Every use had to be imagined before the bucket was even lifted. Water was not simply there. It had to be fetched, guarded from freezing and spent wisely. Inside the cabin, the buckets are placed near the hearth, though not close enough to be kicked or to crowd the fire. This is where another small winter ritual begins. Water kept too far from the heat may freeze solid overnight. Water kept too near may gather soot, warm unevenly, or invite clumsy accidents. So you learn the best place in the room through repetition. Not by the door, not under the drafty window, not where children, dogs, or tired adults will stumble into it. Just near enough to remain useful. Frontier life is full of these tiny decisions that eventually feel like laws of physics. The first thing you notice is the sound. A bucket near the fire makes small ticking noises as frost melts from the rim. Ice clinks loose and drops into the water. Sometimes a thin skin forms across the surface even indoors, if the room has cooled too much overnight. You break it with a ladle, and the crack is delicate, almost pretty, which feels rather rude given how inconvenient it is. The cabin smells of smoke, iron, damp wool, and now the faint clean scent of thawing water. Washing your face becomes a test of character. The cloth is cold. The water is colder. The shock climbs into your jaw and scalp at once. You gasp, then try to behave as though you meant to do something so foolish. Hands suffer the worst. Every dipping and scrubbing steals warmth from the fingers. The skin dries, reddens, and cracks at the knuckles. In winter, hands reveal a life faster than words do. You can see labour in the splits, raw spots, and roughness. Frontier hands are not decorative objects. They are overworked tools. For cooking, water must often be warmed before it becomes pleasant or safe for certain tasks. A kettle lives near the fire if there is one, blackened from use and always in rotation. Heat the water too slowly and it wastes precious fuel. Heat too much and it is squandered if no one uses it. There is no faucet to fix bad planning. A pot simmering on the hearth carries a little cloud of steam into the room, and that steam feels almost luxurious. It softens the air. It fogs the cooler glass of a window. It smells faintly of metal, wood smoke, tea if you're lucky, or boiled grain if you're practical. Animals need water too, and they are not interested in your fatigue. Horse troughs ice over. Stock tanks freeze at the edges. Buckets left in a barn may turn solid overnight. So part of the day often includes breaking ice for livestock and carrying fresh water where possible. The sound of a stick or iron bar striking frozen troughs becomes common in winter yards. Crack, pause, crack again. Then the low, eager sounds of animals drinking, steam rising from their nostrils into the brittle morning air. A quirky detail from the period is that some households dropped heated stones or pieces of hot iron into larger containers to help keep water usable, or to thaw smaller frozen amounts more quickly. It was not elegant, but elegance rarely draws a bucket. People also kept water crocks wrapped, lidded, or tucked into warmer corners of the room. Even bed warmers and bricks heated by the fire sometimes shared company with water vessels in the nightly struggle against freezing. The cabin could feel like a small museum of things trying not to become solid. There were dangers in all this. Ice on paths could bring falls. Thin river ice could break under a careless step. Frozen pump parts could snap. Carrying heavy water on stiff legs invited slips, strained backs, and wet boots. And wet boots in freezing weather are almost insultingly dangerous. If gloves got soaked while breaking ice, fingers could numb in minutes. Frostbite was a real threat in severe conditions, especially when work demanded repeated exposure. The cold did not care whether your errand was noble or ordinary. It punished both evenly. Some families tried to fetch extra water before nightfall, knowing the darkness made every trip harder. A lantern swinging beside a bucket in bitter wind is a lonely sight. The flame trembles. The metal handle grows harsher with each minute. Ice gleams on the ground where you least want it. Everything sounds farther away at night, even your own footsteps. The temptation to postpone the task until morning must have been powerful. So was thirst. Scholars still debate how often popular frontier memoirs understated domestic labour such as water hauling, especially women's labour, because adventure narratives tended to favour trails, battles, hunts, and public drama over the endless private work that kept households alive. Yet much of winter survival rested on exactly these repeated tasks. Someone had to notice the buckets skinning over. Someone had to refill the kettle. Someone had to carry, thaw, pour, wipe, and begin again. The grand myths of the West often rode past the water pail without even tipping a hat. When laundry entered the picture, winter became almost comically hostile. Washing clothes required water in quantity, heated if possible, then wringing, scrubbing, rinsing, and drying in air that wanted every damp thing to turn rigid. Clothes could freeze on the line before they dried, hanging stiff and ghostly in the yard. The sight is memorable. A shirt standing at attention in the wind, stockings like wooden tubes, a petticoat frozen into an opinion. Eventually they dry, but the process has all the charm of a negotiation with a very literal sky. Even drinking water can be unpleasantly cold. You lift a tin cup and feel the chill through the metal before it reaches your mouth. The first swallow seems to cool your teeth. In the morning it can be bracing. By evening it feels personal. Coffee and tea become not just comforts but strategies. Ways of taking in warmth that lasts a few blessed minutes. Soup does the same. Broth in a bowl is practically frontier diplomacy between body and season. Touch, more than anything, defines this work. The scrape of ice against the bucket rim, the roughness of rope, the smooth deadly cold of iron, the ache in the forearm after carrying, the wet patch at the glove cuff, the brief blessing of steam against your face when warm water is finally poured into a basin. You remember each sensation because winter insists that the simplest objects be felt fully. By afternoon, the household has already gone through more water than seems reasonable. A cup here, a pot there, a splash for washing, a little for the animals, some for dough or porridge, some simply lost to clumsy spilling. Because people are tired and floors are uneven and life refuses to be a demonstration of perfect efficiency. So the buckets are lighter again, and that means another trip soon. Water is never finished as a chore. It only pauses long enough to laugh quietly at your optimism. As dusk gathers, you check the remaining supply with the same wary eye one might give firewood or lamp oil. There is enough for supper, enough for a few drinks, enough to keep a kettle near the hearth through the night. A thin sheen already forms at the edge of one neglected pail by the colder wall. You move it closer to the warmth and watch the surface settle. That is winter water on the frontier, heavy, necessary, forever threatening to vanish into ice. It asks for muscle, planning, patience, and hands willing to go numb several times a day. Yet without it, no bread rises, no coffee steams, no stew simmers, no animal thrives, and no person lasts long in the dry, bitter cold. So you haul it, guard it, warm it, and use it carefully, knowing that every ordinary sip has been earned all the way from the frozen dark. Night arrives early in winter, and it never seems entirely reasonable. The light fades while the work is still half done, and the world outside the cabin window turns from grey to blue to black with a speed that feels almost insulting. You look up from the table, from the stove, from the last chore in your hands, and suddenly the day has gone. What remains is darkness, cold, and the long effort of getting through the hours until morning. This is when the frontier feels smallest. Daytime spreads life across the yard, the road, the barn, the creek path, the woodpile, the fence line. Night gathers it all back into one room. A lamp is lit, the fire is fed, the door is barred or latched. Boots are set near the hearth, wet gloves are turned so the heat can reach the fingers. Then the cabin settles into its evening shape. A tiny island of warmth and light surrounded by miles of cold that would rather not be ignored. The first thing you notice is the sound of the house after dark. Boards contract in the dropping temperature and answer with little ticks and dry pops. The wind presses against the walls and then slips around them, nosing at every seam. Now and then it finds the chimney and makes a low hollow moan, the kind of sound that always seems more supernatural than it really is. A shutter taps. A loose hinge gives a faint complaint. Something moves in the straw outside. Perhaps a dog circling down. Perhaps a horse shifting its weight in the barn. Every noise grows sharper because there are fewer of them. Inside, the atmosphere is thick with familiar smells. Wood smoke, tallow, cooked beans, wool drying by the fire, leather warming enough to release its heavy scent. Maybe onions, maybe salt pork, maybe coffee if the household can afford such grace. Evening food matters beyond hunger. It fills the room with steam and odour and the sense that effort has turned into something shareable. A pot on the stove or over the hearth gives off a soft bubbling sound that can make even a rough cabin feel briefly civilised. Supper itself is usually plain. Beans, cornbread, biscuits if flour and fat allow, maybe bacon, maybe stew stretched from whatever could be had. Frontier winter meals favoured keeping power over elegance. Nobody on the plains in bitter weather is asking whether the menu feels adventurous. The question is simpler. Will it warm the body, and will there be enough left for tomorrow? You eat slowly when the room is warmest, feeling the heat of the food spread through your chest and stomach. It is one of the few kinds of comfort that enters from the inside out. After the meal, the room changes again. Dishes are wiped or washed with care. Because cold water punishes delay, a spoon is set aside, a bowl is dried, crumbs are brushed away before they become an invitation to mice. The lamp flame is trimmed, the fire is adjusted for the night. These are small acts, but they carry weight. Evening on the frontier is not leisure in any modern sense. It is maintenance wrapped in dim light. A tallow candle burns with a smell that is hard to call pleasant, but impossible not to recognise. It carries a faint fatty sweetness, mixed with smoke, and throws a softer, weaker light than later generations would tolerate for long. If the household has lamp oil, the flame may be steadier, though fuel for lighting must be watched carefully. Darkness is expensive to resist. Every inch of extra wick, every unnecessary hour of flame, asks to be justified. So people sat close to the light, close to the fire, and close to one another if there was company. The shadows in the room seem to have their own life. Firelight moves along the walls and roof beams. A hanging coat grows broad and strange in silhouette. A kettle handle flashes, then dulls again. The corner beyond the bed remains murky no matter how you squint at it, a private kingdom for trunks, boots, and any mouse with social ambitions. This shifting light has a calming quality after a while. It narrows the world to what you can actually use, actually touch. Hands seek work even at night. A shirt is mended, a harness strap is checked, corn is shelled into a bowl, socks are darned, a button is sewn back where it belongs. These are evening tasks because daylight hours are often too crowded, and because a person who keeps the fingers moving may think less about the dark beyond the walls. Needlework by firelight is slow and a little punishing on the eyes. But it continues because tomorrow arrives whether or not your mitten has a hole. The cold asserts itself most cruelly at the edges of the room. Your front may be warm while your back grows stiff. Knees near the fire relax, while your heels remain chilled through stockings and boot leather. If you shift too far from the hearth, the air changes immediately. The cabin teaches you its geography of comfort night after night. Here, near the stove door, is best. There, by the outer wall, misery waits. Near the table's far end is tolerable. Beside the window is an argument with frost. You learn these zones the way a sailor learns currents. Outside, the darkness on the plains or in the mountain valleys feels immense. With so little artificial light, the night belongs largely to stars, moon, and weather. On clear evenings, the sky can appear almost sharp, every star bright enough to seem near. On overcast nights, the blackness is heavier, pressing close against the cabin with no distant glow to soften it. Snow, when it comes, changes everything again. It reflects a strange pale light, enough to show fences, roofs, and the rounded backs of drifts, while the air itself remains deeply silent. Sleep does not come easily just because the day was hard. That is one of winter's petty tricks. You may be tired clear through, yet still lie awake because your feet are cold, or the wind has changed, or the fire has settled too low. Beds were often layered with quilts, blankets, coverlets, skins, and whatever else could hold warmth. Feather beds existed, prized and soft by frontier standards, but many people slept on straw ticks, corn husk mattresses, or rougher arrangements. The bedding might be heavy enough to pin you pleasantly, or merely a stack of earnest disappointments that never quite reach the feet. Before climbing into bed, many households performed a little campaign against the cold. Bricks or stones might be heated near the hearth and wrapped in cloth. A warming pan, where available, could be used to take the edge off the sheets. Hot coals were banked carefully in the stove. The door was checked. The remaining water was moved closer to the warmest part of the room. These acts did not make the night luxurious. They made it survivable with slightly less complaint. One quirky detail from the era is how often people slept in nightcaps, scarves, socks, and layers far beyond what modern bedrooms would tolerate. The idea of dressing for bed sounds odd, only if you have grown used to waking indoors without seeing your breath. In a frontier winter cabin, exposed ears and toes can stage a rebellion by midnight. Better to wrap the head, tuck the hands close, and accept that elegance has left the premises until spring. You lie down at last and feel the mattress rustle beneath you. The sheets, if there are sheets, are cool first, then warmer where your body persuades them. The blanket scratches your chin. The smell is a mixture of soap from some earlier washing, smoke from the room, and human sleep gathered over many nights. You curl slightly without thinking, protecting the centre of yourself. Everyone does. Bodies know things pride never learns. The sounds continue after the lamp is lowered. Wind along the roof, a brief spit from the fire, a log settling with a sigh and a soft collapse of embers, horses shifting outside, maybe a coyote far off, its cry thin and eerie in the frozen air, maybe wolves in some regions, though far fewer near settled places, maybe only the imagination, which becomes much more energetic once a room goes dim. The frontier night has always encouraged stories, and not all of them make good bedtime companions. Historians generally agree that winter nights in 19th century rural America were shaped not only by cold but by limited light, close quarters, and the demands of fuel economy. People often went to bed earlier in winter because there was less practical reason to remain awake once the day's work and supper were finished. Yet earlier did not always mean restful. The work animals still needed hearing, weather still had to be watched, babies still cried, the sick still coughed, fires still needed judging. Night was not empty time. It was merely quieter labour. Fear had its place too, though perhaps not the dramatic sort later dime novels preferred. The real worries were ordinary and therefore persistent. Would the fire hold enough coals till dawn? Would the wind worsen? Would the cow calve in the night? Would the child with the cough start wheezing again? Would the water freeze? Would a spark pop onto the floorboards? Would some stranger come to the door needing help, or bringing trouble, or both? A frontier cabin at night is full of responsibilities that do not sleep just because people try to. There is a scholarly debate about how often later Western storytelling exaggerated the loneliness of these nights while overlooking the routines, reading, visiting, music-making, and domestic occupations that also filled them. Some households certainly endured great isolation. Others had neighbours near enough for occasional company, songs, card games, shared stories, or mutual help. The night was not always bleak. Sometimes it held quiet pleasure, a fiddle tune, a passage read aloud, children nodding over the last of the firelight. The trouble is that contentment makes less noise in the archive than hardship does. Even so, the length of winter darkness leaves its mark. You feel it in the slowness of the evening, in the way every small flame matters, in the relief when a blanket finally traps enough warmth around your legs. The room goes still in stages. First the chores end, then the talking dwindles, then only the fire speaks, occasionally, in little clicks and breaths. Your eyes grow heavy from the dim light and the day's labour. The ceiling above fades into shadow. The cold remains at the room's edges, patient and undefeated, but held back for now. At some hour deep in the night you wake and listen. This happens often. The air tastes cooler. The fire has sunk low. The cabin feels suspended in blackness. For a moment you do not move, because warmth has gathered around your body beneath the blankets, and stepping out of it would be pure tragedy. Then you hear a board creak, or the stove settle, or the horse outside nudge the wall, and the world regains its shape. Nothing is wrong. It is only winter continuing to exist. Eventually morning will come by slow degrees, but at night that seems almost theoretical. What you have instead is the small red eye of a banked fire, the rough weight of blankets, the smell of smoke caught in the rafters, and the steady effort of resting inside a season that never really rests itself. This is what those long frontier nights feel like. Not dramatic heroism, not constant terror. Endurance in dim light, measured by embers, breath, and the stubborn choice to stay warm until dawn. Winter does not excuse anyone from work. It simply makes every task slower, colder, and slightly offended by your presence. You wake to the same list of necessities, waiting where you left it. Only now each one has been dusted with frost or made heavier by frozen ground. The animals still need feeding. The meal still needs cooking. The tools still need tending. Clothing still tears. Fences still loosen. Ash still gathers. Bread still has to be mixed by hands that would very much prefer to stay near the fire. You begin with the animals because they complain first, and with admirable consistency. Step into the yard at dawn and the sound greets you at once. A horse nickers from the barn. Chickens fuss in small irritated voices. A cow shifts and breathes steam into the dim air. Pigs root and grunt with the confidence of creatures who believe meals are a human scheduling problem. The smell outdoors is sharp and layered. Frozen earth, manure, hay, leather, animal warmth, smoke drifting low from the cabin chimney. It is not a delicate perfume, but it has the honest quality of life continuing. Feeding stock in winter is harder than in greener seasons because the land offers less. Grass is buried, stiff, or gone. Animals depend more heavily on stored hay, grain, fodder, and whatever forage can still be found. That means someone had to cut and stack feed long before the cold arrived, and now someone has to carry it, shake it loose, and portion it out day after day. You lift hay with a pitchfork, and the dry stalks crackle softly. Dust rises into the cold air and catches in your throat. Bits of chaff cling to your sleeves and neck. The hay smells sweet and dry, almost like summer trying to visit in disguise. A horse turns its head and blows warm breath across your wrist while you work. That brief patch of heat feels almost luxurious. Then you reach for the water bucket and discover a rim of ice again, because the season does not believe in uninterrupted satisfaction. You break the ice, refill what you can, check the feed, latch the gate, and move on. Every animal adds another set of small obligations, and none of them can be postponed simply because your fingers hurt. Chickens require their own diplomacy. They need feed scattered where it can be found, shelter from wind, and eggs gathered before freezing ruins them. You bend into the coop, feeling the change in smell immediately. Feathers, straw, droppings, dusty grain. That warm, close odour of small birds crowded together. They mutter around your boots with suspicious little movements, as though you're both servant and intruder. An egg taken from the nest feels astonishing in your hand. one of the few naturally warm things in the whole morning. Hold it too long and you almost resent having to set it down. Back inside, cooking takes over the centre of the day. A winter kitchen in 1860 was less a room of leisure than a command post with steam. The stove or hearth must be kept going, and every meal starts with fuel management. Too little fire and the pot sulks forever. Too much and wood is wasted. You crouch to stir coals, add kindling, shift a kettle, and judge heat by eye, hand, and habit. A frontier cook learns quickly that dinner depends on timing, flame, and not getting distracted by 3 other emergencies. Bread or biscuits might be mixed in a bowl with flour, salt, lard, perhaps baking soda if available, perhaps yeast for those with patience and luck. Your fingers work through the dough, and the texture tells you things before the mind catches up. Too dry, too sticky, too cold in the room for a good rise. Flour dust settles onto your apron or sleeves. The smell is plain and comforting. Then comes the feel of the dough under your knuckles, soft but resistant, a little warm only if the water was warmed first. In winter, even bread making has to argue with temperature. Stew is another faithful winter companion. Beans simmer, salt pork lends its stern authority. Dried apples may soften in a pot. Cornmeal cooks slowly. Coffee, if there is coffee, transforms the room by scent alone. The smell of it curling through wood smoke and hot iron can make a person forgive a great deal. Not everything in a frontier winter tastes wonderful, but warm food has a way of flattering itself. A spoonful of hot beans in a cold house can seem like high cuisine. Hunger is a generous editor. Cleaning does not disappear in winter either. It merely becomes more inconvenient. Ash has to be carried out. Floorboards or dirt floors must be swept. Grease must be wiped before it hardens where it should not. Dishes are washed with rationed warm water, then dried quickly so they do not leave hands aching longer than necessary. Beds are aired if weather and courage allow. Wet clothing is rotated near the fire, not too close, unless you want the exciting smell of scorched wool to brighten the afternoon. Mending fills many narrow pockets of time. A mitten splits at the thumb, a shirt cuff frays, a saddle strap weakens, a blanket edge comes loose. Frontier life puts immense wear on cloth and leather, and winter multiplies the consequences of neglect. A hole in July is annoying, a hole in January is personal, so you sit near the best light and pull out needle and thread. The thread feels thin and stubborn between dry fingertips. Cloth bunches under your palm. A leather patch has to be forced through with more effort. The work is small, exacting, and relentless. Historians generally agree that domestic labour in frontier households was physically demanding all year, but winter intensified nearly every part of it through cold, darkness, and the need to preserve supplies, food preparation, fuel handling, laundry, sewing, childcare, and animal care all became harder when water froze. Daylight shortened, and movement itself cost more energy. The labour was not dramatic in the way later Western myth preferred. It was continuous, practical, and essential. Without it, the bolder stories would have frozen solid. Even men whose work took them outside most of the day could not ignore indoor tasks entirely. Harness needed repair, boots needed greasing, gun parts required cleaning if used for hunting or protection. Snow or mud had to be knocked from tools, wagon wheels, axe handles, and door latches all demanded attention. A tool left damp could rust. Leather left dry could crack. Iron left neglected could fail at the worst moment. Frontier survival relied not just on owning things, but on keeping them alive enough to keep you alive in return. Children worked too, according to age and ability. They carried kindling, gathered eggs, shelled beans, minded younger siblings, twisted straw, fetched scraps, and learned quickly that winter did not care whether they preferred games. Yet children also slipped fun into the margins. A patch of ice became a challenge. Frost on a window became a place to draw. Snow, if it came, invited quick rough play before someone remembered another chore. That flicker of lightness mattered. It kept the season from becoming only a list of burdens. One curious detail from the period is how much ordinary maintenance depended on homemade mixtures and practical improvisation. Soap might be harsh and lye heavy, made from saved fat and ashes. Grease for boots or harness could come from animal tallow or other available fats, starch, dyes, salves, and cleaning agents were often compounded at home with results ranging from useful to memorable. The frontier household was part workshop, part kitchen, part repair shop, and part daily experiment in whether this jar of something would improve the situation or make it worse. The body feels every bit of this work. Knees complain from bending at the hearth. Wrists ache after wringing cloth. Shoulders tighten from hauling feed or lifting pots. Fingertips grow raw from soap, cold, and thread. The skin along the knuckles splits into neat little lines that sting when touched by brine, ash, or hot water. Aprons brush your legs, skirts catch chair legs, suspenders dig at the shoulders. Boots leave the feet tired and hot only after they have first made them numb. By evening, even sitting down has texture. The room's atmosphere changes with each labour. Morning smells of smoke and porridge. Midday smells of stew, iron, wool, and bread. Afternoon brings soap, damp cloth, hay tracked in from outside, maybe a sour hint from boots drying too close to the warmth. The sounds change too, a spoon against a pot, a broom on boards, scissors clipping thread, a baby fussing, a dog shaking snow from its coat near the door, a lid rattling on a kettle. The small orchestra of usefulness never truly stops. There is no convenient separation between work and care. When you mend a sleeve, you are protecting skin from the wind. When you stir the pot, you are preventing weakness later in the day. When you grease leather, you are saving future labour. When you sweep spilled grain, you are defending tomorrow's feed from mice. Every act has consequences. The frontier teaches this point with exhausting thoroughness. Nothing is just one task. Scholars still debate how accurately later memories captured the division of labour in frontier households, since memoirs, novels, and local histories often simplified or idealised who did what. In practice, necessity could blur many neat categories. Women might chop wood, haul water, or manage stock when needed. Men might cook, tend children, sew repairs, or wash dishes under certain conditions. Boarding houses, ranch crews, mining camps, military families, and farmsteads all arranged labour differently. Winter had a way of promoting whoever was present and able. Ideals mattered less than getting supper made and the animals fed. There is also the work of watching. A simmering pot must be noticed before it burns. A draught under the door must be blocked. A child's cough must be listened to. A stovepipe must be checked. A lamp flame must be trimmed before it gutters or smokes too heavily. This quiet attention is easy to overlook because it leaves fewer dramatic traces. But it may be the most tiring labour of all. You cannot fully rest while everything around you depends on being observed. By late afternoon, the light has already begun to thin. You have fed, swept, mended, lifted, stirred, wiped, carried, checked, and begun again. Yet the room does not look conquered. There is still a pot to tend, still a garment to hang nearer the fire, still a pan to clean, still fodder for the next round. Winter work has a peculiar way of erasing its own evidence. The meal is eaten, the floor gets dirty again, the woodpile shrinks, the ashes return. You spend a day buying order by the hour, and still, there is a stern kind of satisfaction in it. The loaf comes from the oven browned at the edges. The harness strap holds. The cow is watered. The eggs are safe from freezing. A patched blanket can serve another night. The room, though modest, smells of food and smoke and effort turned useful. You sit for a moment with tired hands in your lap and hear the soft burble of a kettle, the low rustle of an animal outside, the faint snap from the stove, and you know that work in winter is not merely endless. It is the shape survival takes when no one is singing about it. That is the great truth of a Wild West winter day in 1860. The season offers no pause, no ceremonial respect for fatigue, no applause for repetition. It gives you animals, meals, torn cloth, cooling embers, and one more round of chores before dark. You answer by doing them, not grandly, not perfectly, just steadily enough that the house stays fed, clothed, mended, and alive against the cold. Sickness feels larger in winter, It occupies more space in the room, more room in the mind, and more risk in every small delay. A cough at the table is not just a cough when the air is freezing. The windows leak, and the nearest doctor may be many miles away or not present at all. On the frontier in 1860, illness arrives in a place already burdened by cold, fatigue, and limited supplies. That combination makes every fever more serious, every chill more suspicious, and every recovery a matter of patience mixed with luck. You notice first how carefully people listen. A child coughing in the corner draws every ear. A man clearing his throat after coming in from the yard earns a glance over the cup. A woman who sits down too suddenly after standing at the stove is watched in a way that pretends not to be worry. Winter sharpens attention because the body has less spare strength to waste. When weather is hard, even a mild sickness can become a dangerous guest. The cabin air does not help. It is warm near the stove and cold at the edges, smoky at times, dry almost always, and crowded with the smells of wool, ash, tallow, damp leather, and people living close together. Smoke can irritate the throat. Draughts sting the chest. Damp clothing laid too near the fire fills the room with a stale, wet smell that is somehow both comforting and faintly discouraging. In such air, coughs linger, noses run, eyes water, sleep grows shallow. A healthy body already works hard here. A sick one works harder. Respiratory illness was a constant frontier fear. Historians generally agree that colds, influenza, bronchitis, pneumonia, and other chest complaints could become especially serious during harsh weather, when exposure, poor nutrition, and overwork lowered resistance. The language people used varied, of course. A heavy cold might be called a chill, a fever, a catarrh, or a congestion of the lungs. Not everyone distinguished neatly between conditions that modern medicine would classify more precisely. What mattered in the room was simpler. Could the person breathe well, stay warm, keep fluids down, and rise again in a few days? A cough sounds different at night. In daylight it can be folded into chores and noise. After dark it seems to strike the whole room. One sharp bark, then another, then the thin silence afterward, during which everyone quietly wonders whether this is ordinary or the start of something worse. You hear the scrape of a cup being lifted, a spoon stirring something warm, the rustle of bedding adjusted, firelight moves against the wall. Nobody says much. Worry rarely improves with speeches. Fever changes the atmosphere of a cabin immediately. One person burns while everyone else remains cold. The sick face flushes, the eyes grow shiny, hair dampens at the temples. The skin feels too warm under a hand already chilled by the room. You sit near the bedside or the pallet, listening to uneven breathing, lifting a cup of water to cracked lips, checking the blanket, then worrying the blanket is too heavy, then worrying the room is too cold. Illness turns even simple objects into decisions. Water becomes more important than ever then. A drink, a cloth wrung cool or warm, a basin nearby, a kettle heating at the hearth. The smell of hot water and herbs rises into the air, along with the sharper note of vinegar, if someone is using it for sponging or cleaning. Steam from a pot can soften the room for a little while, easing dry throats and making the air feel less brittle. It never lasts long. The fire burns down. The draught returns. Another log is needed. Another cloth must be dipped. Many households relied first on home remedies because they had to. A proper physician might be distant, expensive, unavailable, or delayed by weather. So families turned to what they knew or what neighbours recommended. Mustard plasters were used to draw heat to the chest. Onion poultices, goose grease, camphor, vinegar, molasses mixtures, hot teas, whiskey-based tonics, and all manner of patent medicines found their place in winter care. Some helped, some comforted, some probably did very little beyond tasting memorable. A frontier shelf could hold hope in some very odd bottles. One curious detail of the era is how common certain household ingredients became in folk treatment. Honey if available, sage, horehound, flaxseed, garlic, onions, peppermint, and even kerosene in some alarming traditions all entered the world of coughs and chest complaints. The line between remedy and experiment was not always reassuringly bright. Still, When the nearest doctor was far off and the patient could not stop coughing, people used what they had. Necessity has always been willing to trust an aunt's recipe more quickly than a medical journal it has never seen. Touch tells you much about sickness when tools are few. A forehead too hot, hands oddly cold, skin dry or clammy, the stiffness of a swollen joint, the flinch when a blanket is moved, the limp weight of fatigue in an arm being helped upright. Care on the frontier was physical in a very direct way. You lifted, wiped, turned, supported, wrapped, unwrapped, and listened. There were no machines quietly summarizing the body's opinion. There was only the body itself, speaking through heat, breath, colour, and weakness. Frostbite and exposure haunted winter too. A person caught outside too long, returning in wet boots or with numb fingers, had to be watched closely. Skin could go pale, waxy, or later redden painfully as sensation returned. Toes and fingers were particularly vulnerable, as were ears, nose, and cheeks. Rewarming had to be managed with care. Hands held too near the fire might burn skin that could not yet feel properly. Boots removed from swollen feet brought their own misery. The pain of returning circulation is sharp and mean, as if the body resents being asked to come back online. Even minor injuries grew more complicated in cold months. A cracked hand could become inflamed. A cut from an axe or knife might be harder to clean well when water froze and washing stung. A twisted ankle on ice could limit a person's ability to fetch wood or water, which then shifted work onto everyone else. One body's trouble became a household problem almost at once. Winter did not allow much isolation of consequences. Children and older adults were especially vulnerable. Small bodies lose heat quickly. Elderly ones may struggle to recover strength after illness takes hold. The sight of a child dozing too long by the fire with flushed cheeks and dry lips could unnerve an entire family. So could the slower, more silent weakness of an older person who stopped eating, stopped talking, or simply seemed to sink inward over several days, in cabins where beds, chairs, and work were all close together. Decline was visible at every hour. There was little privacy in suffering. Historians broadly agree that mortality from infectious disease, complications of exposure, and inadequate medical care remained significant across many frontier communities, yet the exact picture varied widely by region, season, and settlement pattern. Military posts had surgeons, at least sometimes. Larger towns might support a physician or apothecary. Remote ranches, isolated claims, wagon trains, and rough camps often had only practical knowledge, scattered medicine chests, and whatever advice could be gathered from neighbours, indigenous healers, midwives, or passing experience. Healthcare on the frontier was rarely a smooth system. It was a patchwork stitched under pressure. The emotional climate of sickness can be as difficult as the illness itself. Work does not stop simply because someone is unwell. The animals still need feeding. Water still needs hauling. Bread still needs mixing. Fire still needs tending. So the healthy grow more tired, and the sick often feel guilty for becoming a burden they never intended to be. That guilt sits heavily in the room. You can hear it in apologies whispered between coughs, in the stubborn attempt to rise too soon, in the way someone insists they are quite all right while swaying visibly beside the chair. Night makes all of it heavier. Fever seems hotter after dark. The wind sounds colder. The sick bed feels lonelier. Someone wakes to check the fire, then checks the patient, then lies back down without fully sleeping. A cup of water is offered in the dark. A cough starts again. A child whimpers. A floorboard creaks under quiet footsteps. The smell of warmed bricks, herbal tea, and old smoke settles low in the room. Hours pass one small sound at a time. There was scholarly uncertainty, and still is, about how much frontier memoir literature underreported the role of women, midwives, and informal caregivers in winter illness. Their work was intimate, repetitive, and not always considered worth grand description by later chroniclers. Yet much of it was the very substance of survival. Someone watched through the night. Someone brewed the bitter tea. Someone changed the bedding, fed the broth, soothed the child, and carried the burden of deciding when home care was no longer enough. Those acts rarely made legends. They made mornings possible, Patent medicines added another layer of hope and confusion. By 1860, travelling salesmen and store shelves in many towns offered bottled cures with ambitious promises and modest restraint. Tonics for coughs, elixirs for fevers, restoratives for nerves, pain soothers, blood purifiers, and compounds for nearly every complaint found willing buyers. Some contained alcohol or opiates, others were mostly marketing in liquid form. A label could sound wonderfully authoritative when a person was frightened. Out on the frontier, fear and hope have always been easy business partners. You also feared what sickness could do to food and strength. A person too ill to eat loses heat. A person who cannot keep broth down weakens quickly. So caregivers tried whatever might tempt the body to continue. Weak tea, toast, gruel, soup, milk if it could be had, a little coffee, a spoon of molasses, anything warm, mild, and possible. The smell of broth simmering for an invalid has a particular tenderness to it. Part kitchen, part prayer. Sometimes a sick person recovered slowly, almost shyly. The fever broke. The cough loosened. The appetite returned in little flashes. A face that had looked strange in illness began to resemble itself again. That kind of improvement changed the whole room. Shoulders lowered, voices softened. The fire seemed more companionable. Even the air felt easier to breathe. Recovery on the frontier was never taken for granted. It was noticed with gratitude, and often with exhaustion close behind it. Sometimes recovery did not come quickly, and the mood shifted in another direction. Neighbours might be called, a rider sent for a doctor, more blankets gathered, more remedies attempted, more watching done in silence. The body, despite all attention, could continue downward. Winter gave illness extra leverage because warmth, food, rest, medicine, and skilled care were all harder to secure at once. That is the part people feared most. Not only being sick, but being sick in a season already stacked against resilience. By morning, if the patient sleeps a little easier, the room itself seems to exhale. Ash still needs carrying. Water still needs fetching. Nothing practical has changed, yet hope has weight, just as worry does. You feel it when you move the kettle, when you fold a cloth, when you hear a steadier breath from the bed. The cabin remains rough, smoky, and cold at the edges. But for a while it has become a place of tending rather than alarm. That is what sickness meant in a Wild West winter. Not merely pain or fever, but the frightening way illness could seize a household already living close to the edge of fatigue. It tested stores, skills, patience, and faith in equal measure. It turned kitchens into sick rooms, blankets into medicine, and ordinary people into constant nurses. In a season ruled by cold, health was never a quiet assumption. It was a fragile warmth, watched closely and defended as long as human hands could manage. Winter can make even the proudest household reconsider the value of other human beings. On clear summer days, distance feels romantic. A cabin standing by itself on open ground suggests independence, self-possession, and the pleasing idea that no one will borrow your tools without asking. In winter, that same distance can feel like a long, cold sentence. The road disappears under snow or freezes into ruts. Wind empties the fields of movement. Night comes early. Then the lamp glows in your own window, and somewhere far off another lamp answers from a neighbour's place, faint and golden in the dark. At such moments, company begins to look less like intrusion and more like civilization. The frontier was never as solitary as legend liked to pretend. Yes, there were scattered claims, lonely ranches, far-flung camps, and miles of weather between one family and the next. But winter made plain what had always been true. People survived partly because they leaned on one another, sometimes gladly, sometimes awkwardly, and sometimes while insisting they were doing no such thing. Pride is durable. So is necessity. The two often share a fence line. You feel this most clearly when something runs short. Wood, flour, lamp oil, medicine, nails, a strong back, an extra blanket, a hand to steady the horse, someone to watch the children while water is hauled, someone to sit with the feverish while the fire is tended. Scarcity turns neighbours into a kind of winter currency. Not always easy, not always generous, but valuable beyond measure. A knock at the door after dusk carries different meanings depending on the season. In winter, it almost always matters. The sound lands in the room and everyone looks up. Perhaps it is a traveller asking to warm himself briefly. Perhaps a nearby settler has come to borrow live coals after a fire went out. Perhaps someone needs help with a sick child, a calving cow, a broken sleigh runner, or a man who has not returned from the creek path. The door opens and a gust of cold enters first, followed by a figure powdered with frost, boots stiff, scarf high, breath pouring white into the cabin air. The smell changes at once. Snow, leather, horse sweat, frozen wool, and outside air rush in, cutting through the heavier sense of soup and smoke. The visitor stomps or knocks snow from boots, and everyone shifts to make room near the stove or hearth. A hat comes off. Gloves are worked free from reluctant fingers. Someone offers a chair or the edge of a bench. Someone else pours coffee if any remains, or hot water, or broth, because warmth given quickly can be as useful as words. Hospitality on the frontier was not always soft-hearted or sentimental. Sometimes it was simply practical ethics. A person left out in severe cold might not fare well. A team caught on the road after dark might need shelter. Even households with modest means often offered at least a little heat, food, or floor space when conditions were bad. That did not mean everyone trusted everyone. Far from it. But winter could force a rough version of courtesy between strangers who, in fair weather, might have preferred a little more distance and a little less storytelling. Neighbours mattered even more than strangers. These were the people whose smoke you watched on the horizon, whose dogs barked at odd hours, whose children's footprints turned up near the path, whose wagon tracks told you someone had made it to town and back. In winter, you noticed absences. A chimney that did not smoke by late morning, a gate left open too long, no lamp after sunset, no one at the usual water route. Such silences carried weight. Historians generally agree that mutual aid was a crucial but often under-celebrated part of frontier survival. People borrowed tools, traded labour, shared transport, swapped food, helped with births and sickness, and joined together for tasks too heavy, or urgent for one household alone. The exact pattern varied by region, ethnicity, class, religion, and settlement type. But the principle held widely. Winter made interdependence visible. The myth of total self-sufficiency looks impressive from a distance. Up close, it often turns out to be standing on someone else's wagon sled. When weather turned severe, men might gather to cut and haul wood for an older widow, a sick household, or a family with too few working hands. Women might exchange bread, broth, cloth, remedies, childcare, or the kind of patient labour that saves a room from falling into chaos. Teenagers could carry messages between places when roads were passable. Children fetched small items, delivered notes, and absorbed from all this an education in shared survival more honest than any school primer. There is sound in this cooperation too, the crunch of several booted feet approaching together, the thud of wood dropped by the wall, voices in the yard, low and practical, harness chains clinking, a borrowed shovel striking packed snow, laughter, occasionally, because hardship often invites humour as a last defence against becoming unbearable. Frontier jokes had a dry quality in winter. A man delivering extra firewood might remark that he only brought it to keep the neighbour from becoming decorative ice. Such lines are not elegant, but they can warm a room almost as fast as coffee. Trade took many forms. Eggs for flour, a day of chopping for help mending harness, quilting labour exchanged for a sack of cornmeal, a spare pail loaned during a freeze, a good milk cow's product shared with a household nursing the sick, soap swapped for candles, information traded too, which could be as valuable as goods, which road had drifted shut, which creek crossing was safe, which merchant still had salt, which doctor was in town, which family might need checking on after the storm. On the frontier, gossip and logistics often wore the same coat. A curious detail from the period is how often social gatherings in winter were both practical and pleasurable at once. Quilting bees, husking gatherings, Butcher days, church socials, and evening visits could combine labour, news, courtship, food, and mutual reassurance. A room full of people generated heat as surely as it generated noise. Hands stitched while mouths talked. A fiddle might come out if the mood and weather allowed. Someone told a tale that became funnier in the telling. Children drowsed on coats piled in the corner. Winter fellowship was rarely idle. It was useful company, which may be the best kind. Of course! Neighbours could also be difficult. Shared survival did not erase grudges, property disputes, old insults, or differing ideas about fences, religion, politics, livestock. And who had borrowed that auger 6 months ago? Some people gave help grudgingly, others received it awkwardly. A loan could become a point of pride. An unpaid favour might sour by spring. Winter makes people need one another, but it does not automatically improve their personalities. Human nature arrives at the cabin door wearing the same boots as everyone else. Yet even tense relationships could bend under pressure. A blizzard, a sickness, or a lost team often cut through old stiffness faster than polite society ever managed. There are many accounts from frontier life of enemies, rivals, or mere acquaintances assisting one another in emergencies because circumstances allowed no time for ceremony. A sled was needed, a rider had to go, a body must be warmed, a child had to be watched. In those moments, weather became the larger fact and private resentment had to stand aside, at least until conditions improved enough for people to resume being complicated. Touch carries meaning here too. A borrowed blanket pressed into your arms at the door, a firm hand under the elbow on an icy step, the rough shake of gloves between men who are not quite friends but have just done each other a significant kindness, a woman tucking quilts around a neighbour's child while the mother rests, hands passing bowls, boards, candles, tools, cups, babies, bundles of wood, and handwritten notes. Winter cooperation is physical. It moves through objects and gestures more than speeches. Scholars still debate how much later frontier memory downplayed the role of immigrant networks. Native knowledge, black communities, Hispanic settlements, religious congregations, and women's informal circles in sustaining winter life. The famous image of the isolated Anglo-settler cabin has long overshadowed the richer reality of the West's many overlapping communities. In truth, survival often depended on local knowledge carried across languages and cultures and traditions. Who knew which route stayed open? Who knew how to build against wind? Who knew what to feed the sick? How to store roots, where timber could still be found? How to read clouds over the ridge? The archive can be lopsided. The weather was not. You notice something else on winter evenings when company arrives. The room grows easier, not warmer only, though several bodies and more talk do seem to lift the air. Easier. Silence breaks. Worry spreads out. Someone else hears the baby cough and says it sounds better than yesterday. Someone notices the door draft and stuffs it tighter. Someone brings a newspaper weeks old, and suddenly there are stories from far away. Someone has seen tracks near the creek and warns the others. Even bad news feels more manageable when spoken among several people instead of turning alone in your own head. Games, songs, and stories had their place too. A deck of cards worn soft by use, hymns sung low, ballads, comic recitations, Bible readings, local tales, and the endless retelling of who got lost where and whose mule had more sense than its owner. Such moments were not trivial. They kept minds from folding inward under the weight of dark and cold. Entertainment on the frontier was rarely separate from emotional survival. Laughter in a rough cabin can be as practical as mending. Sometimes help arrived without flourish. A split load of wood left by the wall, fresh bread brought over in a cloth, a boy sent with a jar of broth, a neighbour appearing at dawn with the simple statement that he was going to town and could fetch anything needed. These quiet acts often mattered most because they came before a request had to be made. Need is easier to bear when someone has already seen it. There were limits. Of course, not every community was kind. Not every person had enough to share. Harsh winters could strain all stores at once and turn generosity thin with fear. A family on the edge might have no help to spare because it was busy trying not to fail itself. That, too, is part of the truth. Mutual aid could ease winter. It could not always overcome a season that hit widely and hard. Still, the shared nature of survival remained one of the deepest realities of frontier cold. When a storm passed and people emerged to check roads, stock, roofs, and one another, the settlement briefly revealed its hidden threads. One house lent a shovel, another offered coffee, a third had heard of a missing traveller, someone hitched a team, someone packed food, someone watched the children. Bit by bit, the place held. By the time the lamps burn low and the last visitor pulls on cold gloves to head home, the room has taken on that peculiar afterglow of company. Cups stand empty. A chair has been dragged close to the fire. Melted snow darkens the floor near the door. The air holds the layered scents of smoke, wet wool, coffee, and human presence. Outside, the dark remains broad and severe. Inside, however, the evening has been divided among voices, tasks, and shared concern. Winter feels less like a sentence when it is spoken in the plural. That is what neighbours, strangers, and shared survival meant in a Wild West winter. Not constant harmony, not romantic frontier fellowship polished for later paintings. Something rougher and truer. Borrowed coals, exchanged labour, warned roads, shared broth, a hand at the right hour. In a season that could reduce every household to its barest needs, human company often proved to be one of the most practical provisions of all. By late winter, your body knows things it did not know when the cold first arrived. It knows how to wake before dawn and judge the room by breath alone. It knows which board near the bed will feel least terrible under a bare foot. It knows how many sticks the stove wants before supper, and how long a kettle should sit near the coals before the water loses its bite. Survival has become a craft made of habits, and the habits have settled so deeply into you that they now feel older than the season itself. Outside, the world still looks harsh enough. Snow lingers in shadowed places. Fence posts wear pale crusts of frost at sunrise. The yard is stamped hard by boots, hooves, and dragged loads. Trees, where there are trees, stand dark and spare against a washed-out sky. Yet something is changing, not quickly. Winter never surrenders with grace, but the light stays a little longer each evening, and when the sun reaches the wall of the cabin, you can sometimes feel the faintest softness in it. Not warmth exactly, a promise of warmth, which is almost more dangerous because hope makes people impatient. You step outside at midday and pause to listen. The sound of the season is shifting. There is still the familiar crunch underfoot, still the dry complaint of wind against boards, still the distant chop of someone splitting wood. But now and then, another sound joins them. A drip from the eaves during a brighter hour, a wet slide from a roof edge, the small sucking noise of mud beginning to think about returning. Those sounds are humble, but after months of hard freeze they carry the emotional force of a brass band. The smell changes too. Smoke remains, of course. It has lived in your coat, your hair, your blankets, and probably your general philosophy for weeks. But beneath it comes the darker scent of thawing ground where the sun strikes longest. Wet earth. Old straw. Manure waking up with a rude confidence. A hint of rot from leaves trapped under snow. None of it is pretty, and all of it is thrilling. Spring on the frontier does not arrive perfumed. It arrives honest. You have less fuel than you once did, and you know it by sight. The woodpile that looked respectable in early winter now appears lean and exposed. Stacks of brush have thinned. The store of chips is lower. Every armful carried indoors is measured against the changing weather. Can you spare more for comfort, or must you still guard against another hard snap? This is one of late winter's private tensions. The heart wants to believe the worst is over. Experience mutters that March can behave like a traitor. Historians generally agree that late winter and early spring were often among the most trying periods in 19th century rural life, not because cold had vanished, but because stores had dwindled and patience with hardship had worn thin. Food could run low. Seed grain had to be protected from becoming dinner. Animal fodder might be reduced. Clothing was worn thin at the elbows and knees. Boots had taken months of abuse. By the time the season began to loosen its grip, many households were at their most tired. Survival had succeeded, but it had not done so gently. You feel that fatigue everywhere. In the shoulders when you lift a pail. In the slowness with which people sit and stand. In the way hands pause at the table for a second longer before reaching for the next task. Winter exhaustion is unlike the tiredness of harvest or travel. It is quieter and more settled. It comes from being cold too often, indoors too long, alert too constantly, and required too many times in one day to make the same small correct decision. The cabin shows the season's wear as clearly as any face. Chinking has loosened in spots. The floor bears a map of scratches, ash stains, and damp marks. A chair wobbles. A blanket edge hangs with fresh repairs. The kettle bottom is black with use. One mitten has been patched so often it now appears to belong to several generations of sheep at once. The whole room carries the look of things that have been depended upon without rest. It is an honourable kind of wear, though not an elegant one. Animals feel the change first, or seem to. Horses grow more restless in the yard. Chickens complain with greater purpose. Dogs spend longer moments with noses lifted to the breeze. Livestock still need feed, still need water, still need watching, but they carry an impatience in them now, as if the season has become repetitive and therefore personally offensive. You understand the feeling? There are more hours for work, which is both blessing and trap. With extra light comes the temptation to begin everything at once. Repairs long postponed suddenly demand attention. Fences must be checked where frost has pushed posts loose. Tools need proper cleaning. Harness must be inspected. Seed stores are counted. Garden plots, if there will be gardens, are considered with cautious imagination. The roof ought to be looked at. The barn latch wants fixing. The path to the creek is slick where thaw and freeze have formed uneven ridges. Late winter does not bring rest. It brings a fresh list. One curious detail from frontier life is that the first signs of thaw could create as much annoyance as delight. Roads turned to rutted mud. Wagon wheels sank. Boots grew soaked. Meltwater found every weakness in a roof. Livestock yards became soft and foul underfoot. What had been crisp and difficult became messy and difficult. The season changed its methods, not its character. Frontier weather was apparently very committed to being memorable. You notice people talking more openly about future plans now. Seed, travel, repairs, schooling, a trip to town, new cloth, a calf expected, a roof to raise, a letter to send once roads improve. These plans are spoken carefully, as though winter might overhear and decide to laugh. Yet they come all the same. The human mind cannot stay fixed only on endurance forever. It needs a next thing. Even imagining spring work becomes its own kind of warmth. There is also more movement among neighbours. Roads become passable in short windows. Visitors appear with news. Someone has gone to town and returned with salt, nails, lamp oil, or rumour. Someone else has heard that a merchant expects a shipment when the river clears. Families compare how much feed remains, how many hens are laying, who has been sick, whose roof leaked, whose child outgrew boots at the worst possible moment. Shared complaint becomes almost cheerful now. Misery loves company. Survived misery loves an audience. Scholars still debate how much later Western storytelling favoured triumphant endings over the more complicated reality of seasonal transition. In memory, winter often becomes a neat arc. Snow falls, hardship comes, grit prevails, spring returns. Real life was less tidy. People entered thaw with debts, repairs, illnesses, losses, and lingering weakness. Some had buried stock, some had buried hopes, some had buried people. Others came through with little more than their patience worn thin. Victory, when it existed, often looked like continuation rather than celebration, and continuation is exactly what you feel. You're still here. The cabin still stands, the fire still burns when fed, the kettle still sings. The road, however ugly, still leads outward. In the yard, a patch of ground opens dark beneath the snow. Along the fence line, the ice at the trough weakens sooner each afternoon. A bird appears one morning, not in heroic numbers, just one small feathered visitor making an absurdly hopeful sound from a branch. You stop and listen as though the creature has delivered a formal message. Food tastes different now because scarcity has trained gratitude into every meal. A bowl of beans remains a bowl of beans. But the thought of fresh greens or milk in greater quantity or eggs, not threatened by frost, gives even plain fare a brighter edge. Flour scooped from the sack is measured with sharper awareness. Salt pork cut thinner may soon be replaced by something less severe. Coffee, when there is coffee, seems to belong to the future as much as the present. Your own habits begin to loosen slightly. You do not rush quite so anxiously to bank the fire if the evening seems milder. You leave the door open one heartbeat longer when carrying in water. You stand outside without drawing the scarf quite so high. Then a cold gust cuts through your coat and reminds you not to get poetic too early. Late winter enjoys these little corrections. The texture of the air inside the cabin changes on brighter days. Sun falls through the window and warms the tabletop enough to release the smell of old wood. Damp mittens dry faster. The room feels less like a sealed box and more like a place connected to the world again. You wipe the sill and notice the light catching dust in a golden sheet. Dust never looked so cheerful. Children respond to the season differently from adults. They sense possibility before practicality. A patch of open ground means a place to run. A stream of meltwater means a thing to poke with sticks. A milder afternoon suggests shouting, chasing, festoon, flinging off a cap, then being ordered to put it back on at once. Their energy can be exhausting, but it carries medicine for the spirit. Adults, more cautious, count supplies and study clouds. Children hear a drip and call it freedom. There is scholarly uncertainty about how far winter psychological strain shaped frontier communities, because the language of depression, anxiety, and seasonal stress was not recorded then in modern terms. Yet diaries and letters often suggest loneliness, irritability, cabin weariness, fear, and deep relief at changing light. It is difficult to spend months guarding heat, counting provisions, and listening for sickness without feeling altered by it. The mind, like the body, pays rent to winter. You are altered. Your hands are rougher. Your face has learned the habit of bracing into wind. You no longer waste movement between tasks. You know how to dry gloves without scorching them, how to judge weather by smell, how to save the best coals for morning, how to carry water without slopping half of it onto your boots. Knowledge has moved into muscle. Comfort has been redefined. Luxury, once perhaps a broader idea, now includes dry socks, a full wood box, and soup that stays hot all the way to the last spoonful. As the days continue to lengthen, the settlement itself begins to look less besieged. Smoke still rises from chimneys, but it no longer feels like the only defence against the season. Paths widen. Roof edges clear. People stop in the road to talk a little longer. Someone repairs a gate with an energy that suggests belief in tomorrow. Someone else scrubs a window. Such acts are almost ceremonial. They announce that life is turning outward again. You notice faces more clearly now. The deepened lines beside eyes, chapped cheeks beginning to heal, beards grown fuller through the cold months, a looseness in posture on a mild afternoon. The shared expression is difficult to name. It contains fatigue, certainly, but also pride, relief, and the faint embarrassment of people who have endured a great deal and are not entirely interested in making speeches about it. The frontier had little patience for grand emotional summerers. It preferred getting on with things. Yet there is feeling all the same when the first genuinely soft evening arrives. The light lingers. The yard smells of wet earth and old hay. A trickle of water runs near the path. Somewhere a chicken complains with increased drama. The air against your face feels cool rather than punishing. You stand by the door, holding it open longer than necessary, and realize the cabin behind you is warmer than it used to be. Not because the fire is larger, but because the season is finally losing interest in open warfare. That realization lands quietly. There is no fanfare, only a deep exhale from somewhere inside the ribs. You made it through, not untouched, not unchanged, but through the worst nights, the frozen buckets, the stiff boots, the endless fuel gathering, the coughs, the dark, the careful saving of everything from lamp oil to thread. All of it now belongs to a season beginning to recede. And even then, survival does not feel triumphant in the storybook way. It feels tired, grateful, slightly wary. You know too much now to trust the weather completely. You know a warm day can be followed by sleet. You know roads can vanish in mud as quickly as they open from snow. You know spring brings its own work and its own troubles. But you also know this. The winter that once looked impossible has become a thing you lived inside and then outlasted. So when night falls again, softer than before, you bank the fire with a gentler hand. The room glows, the kettle murmurs. Outside, the dark rests over the settlement without quite the same threat. You sit for a moment listening to distant water dripping from some roof edge, and it sounds like a patient clock counting down the cold. There is no grand declaration to make, only the humble fact of another evening, another breath, another season beginning to turn in your favour. Now the room grows quieter. The labour of the day loosens from your shoulders and drifts away with the smoke above the hearth. The light is softer now, laying a warm gold across worn boards, patched blankets, and the familiar shape of the kettle by the fire. Outside, the last of winter lingers in pale places, but it no longer presses so hard against the walls. You can hear a faint dripping from the eaves, slow and steady, like the land breathing more easily in its sleep. You let your hands rest. They have carried water, split wood, mended cloth, lifted pots, and held on through all the bitter mornings. Now they lie quiet in your lap, rough and warm at last. Your boots sit by the door. Your coat hangs on its peg. The room smells of smoke, old pine, wool, and the gentle promise of tomorrow's light. Nothing here is grand, yet everything feels earned. Beyond the window, the sky darkens into a deep calm blue. One star appears, then another. The yard settles. Animals shift softly in the barn. Somewhere a board gives a tiny creak as the chill returns for the night, though less sharply than before. You pull the blanket closer around yourself and feel its weight settle across your knees, steady and kind. The fire answers with a low crackle, then a hush. There is no need to hurry now. The long season has taught you the pace of endurance, and that pace is slow, patient, and human. You do not have to conquer the night. You only have to rest inside it. Let the warmth gather around you. Let the dark remain outside the walls. Let the hours pass gently, one by one, while the embers glow and fade and glow again. In this small shelter, after so much cold and effort, peace arrives in simple forms: a warm cup, a banked fire, dry boards underfoot, a quieter wind. The knowledge that morning will come, and with it a little more light. You breathe in the soft smoky air, ease back into stillness, and let the season drift farther away, until even the memory of winter feels distant, muted, and calm.